The funeral reception was barely over when my son David approached me in the garage. I was sitting in Harold's old Mercedes, breathing in the faint scent of his cologne that still lingered on the leather seats. 43 years of marriage, and this car held more memories than our house itself. "Mom, you need to be practical now," David said, his voice carrying that patronizing tone I'd been hearing more frequently since Harold's diagnosis. "Sell the car. You don't need it anymore. Dad's gone. And honestly, at your age, driving isn't safe." I looked at him through the windshield. My only son, now 45, wearing his expensive suit and that expression of forced patience he'd perfected over the years. The same expression he'd worn when suggesting I move to a nice assisted living facility just months before his father passed. I smiled in silence. I whispered to myself, my hands gripping the steering wheel. Can you imagine being told by your own child that you're no longer capable of making decisions about your own life? What would you do if the person you sacrificed everything for suddenly saw you as a burden to be managed? I remained quiet in that garage, nodding as if considering his suggestion. But what David didn't know was that his father had prepared for this moment. In the glove compartment, beneath the registration papers and old receipts, lay a document that would soon reveal the true nature of my son's sudden concern for my safety. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I'm 68 years old, and I spent the last 25 years as a forensic accountant before retiring to care for my ailing husband. People see a grieving widow who needs protection from the world's complexities. They're about to learn how wrong they are. That night, after David left with promises to help me through this difficult transition, I sat alone in my study, the same room where Harold and I had planned our retirement, discussed our investments, and made provisions for our future. The house felt different now, not just empty, but somehow invaded by an energy that didn't belong. I pulled out the document Harold had pressed into my hands just weeks before his death, when the morphine still allowed him moments of clarity. His fingers had trembled as he made me promise to read it only after the funeral, only when I was truly alone. The letterhead belonged to Morrison and Associates, Harold's private attorney, not the family lawyer David knew about. As I read the first paragraph, my breath caught in my throat. Harold had been investigating irregularities in our joint accounts, transfers that had been made without my knowledge, signatures that looked like mine but somehow weren't. "Eleanor," the letter began in Harold's handwritten postscript. "I discovered this too late to confront him while I was alive, but I've gathered everything you'll need. Our son has been stealing from us for over 2 years, and he's not planning to stop with my death. The evidence is in the safety deposit box. Box number 2746 at First National. You have the only key now." My hands shook as I set the letter down. 24 months of unexplained withdrawals, forged documents, and what appeared to be preparations for something much larger than simple theft. Harold had uncovered a systematic plan to gain control of our entire estate, a plan that would leave me with nothing but the charity of a son who saw me as an obstacle. I walked back to the garage to Harold's Mercedes and opened the glove compartment again. This time, I wasn't looking at it as a widow seeking comfort. I was looking at it as the forensic accountant I'd been for decades, the woman who'd helped prosecutors track financial crimes that others thought were impossible to prove. David wanted me to sell the car because he thought it represented my independence. He was right about one thing. It did represent independence. What he didn't realize was that this car wasn't just a vehicle. It was evidence, and tomorrow I would begin the process of reclaiming not just my financial security, but my dignity as a woman who refused to be discarded by her own family. As I sat there in the darkness of the garage, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to be anyone's victim. I was going to be their reckoning. The next morning arrived with the kind of deceptive calm that precedes a storm. I made coffee in the kitchen where Harold and I had shared 30 years of quiet breakfasts. But today, the ritual felt different. Every sip was preparation. Every moment of silence was strategy. David called at exactly 9 o'clock, punctual as always when it came to matters he considered important. "Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday." His voice carried that false warmth I was beginning to recognize. "I spoke with Susan last night, and we both agree that you shouldn't be making major decisions right now. Grief can cloud judgment, you know." Susan. My daughter-in-law, who hadn't visited Harold once during his final months, who always had excuses when family dinners were planned, but who suddenly seemed very invested in my well-being. "What kind of decisions are you worried about, David?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, almost fragile. "Well, the house is far too big for you now. And there are financial matters that need professional handling. Dad wasn't exactly organized toward the end. Susan and I think it would be best if I took over managing your accounts just temporarily until you adjust." There it was. The first move in what I now understood was a carefully orchestrated game. "That's very thoughtful of you," I replied, adding just enough tremor to my voice to sound convincing. "I have been feeling overwhelmed by all the paperwork." I could hear the relief in his breathing. "Exactly. Why don't I come over this afternoon? We can go through Dad's desk together, make sure everything's in order." After hanging up, I sat in Harold's study and opened the folder that had been hidden behind his medical files. Page after page of bank statements, photocopied checks, and transaction records told a story that made my forensic accountant training kick into high gear. The pattern was sophisticated, but not undetectable. Small amounts at first, 500 here, 1,000 there, always from accounts Harold rarely monitored. But as Harold's illness progressed and his attention to financial details waned, the amounts grew bolder. 10,000 transferred to medical expenses that never appeared on any hospital bill. 15,000 for home modifications that were never made. The most damaging evidence was a series of emails I found printed and filed meticulously in Harold's handwriting. Messages between David and someone named Marcus Chen, discussing Phase 2 of their plan and the need to accelerate the timeline due to the old man's condition. Harold had been more aware than any of us realized, but the discovery that made my blood run cold was a document dated just 6 weeks ago, a power of attorney form with my signature, authorizing David to make financial decisions on my behalf. The problem was, I had never signed such a document. The signature was good, but not perfect. Harold had circled 3 subtle differences in red ink, with a note: "Eleanor's E always has a slight backward slant when she's tired." This forger didn't know that. My husband had been building a case even as he was dying. When David arrived that afternoon, he brought Susan and a briefcase that looked suspiciously official. Susan's smile was too bright, her concern too theatrical. "Eleanor, you look tired," she said, embracing me with arms that felt like they were measuring my frailty. "We're here to help with everything. You shouldn't have to worry about complicated financial matters at a time like this." They moved through Harold's study with an efficiency that suggested familiarity. David knew exactly which drawers to open, which files to examine. He was looking for something specific, probably the very documents I had already secured. "Mom, I can't find Dad's business account statements anywhere," David said, his casual tone not quite hiding an edge of concern. "He always kept them in this bottom drawer." "Harold moved a lot of papers recently," I said quietly. "He was trying to organize things for me before the end. Maybe he put them somewhere safe." I watched David's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "Do you remember where?" "I'm afraid my memory isn't what it used to be," I replied, allowing my voice to waver slightly. "There are so many things I can't remember clearly since Harold passed." It was a performance worthy of an award, and I could see both David and Susan relax as they interpreted my confusion as genuine helplessness rather than strategic misdirection. Over the next hour, I let them guide me through a conversation about simplifying my finances, consolidating my accounts, and ensuring I had proper support for managing my affairs. Every suggestion was presented as loving concern, every recommendation designed to transfer control of my financial life into David's hands. "We just want to make sure you're protected, Mom," David said as they prepared to leave. "There are so many people who take advantage of people in your situation." The irony was so sharp it nearly made me laugh out loud. That evening, after they left with promises to take care of everything, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to Morrison & Associates to schedule an appointment for the following morning. The second was to my old colleague Janet Rivera, who now worked as a private investigator specializing in financial crimes. The third was to my bank, to inquire about access procedures for safety deposit boxes. As I prepared for bed, I looked at myself in the mirror that had reflected my face for decades. The woman staring back was 68 years old, recently widowed, and apparently seen by her own family as an easy mark for financial manipulation. They were about to discover that this particular woman had spent 25 years learning exactly how to catch people who underestimated her. And unlike Harold, I wasn't running out of time. Tomorrow, the real investigation would begin. The offices of Morrison and Associates occupied the top floor of a building downtown that I'd driven past countless times but never entered. Harold had chosen this firm precisely because of their discretion and their distance from our usual social circles. Thomas Morrison was younger than I'd expected, perhaps 50, with the kind of sharp intelligence that reminded me why Harold had trusted him with secrets he'd kept from his own family. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm deeply sorry for your loss," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his mahogany desk. "Harold was not only a client, but someone I genuinely respected. What he discovered in his final months? Well, it takes courage to face that kind of betrayal." He opened a thick file that made my heart skip. "Your husband hired us 6 months ago when he first noticed irregularities in your joint accounts. What began as a simple inquiry into a few questionable transactions evolved into something much more comprehensive. The first document he showed me was a timeline Harold had helped construct. It began 3 years ago, shortly after Harold's first heart episode, when David had insisted on being added as an emergency contact to several accounts just in case. Your son is remarkably sophisticated in his approach," Morrison continued, his tone clinical but not unkind. "He never took enough to trigger automatic bank notifications, never moved money in patterns that would raise immediate red flags, but over 36 months, he's systematically transferred approximately $240,000 from various accounts." The number hit me like a physical blow. Nearly $250,000 stolen so gradually that neither Harold nor I had noticed until it was almost too late. "But that's not the most concerning part," Morrison said, pulling out another folder. "We believe the cash withdrawals were preparation for something larger. Based on correspondence we've uncovered, your son and his business partner have been developing a plan to gain legal control of your entire estate." He showed me photocopies of emails that made my stomach turn. Messages discussing my diminished capacity, strategies for having me declared incompetent, and detailed financial projections based on liquidating all my assets within 18 months of Harold's death. "They've been planning for your husband's death," Morrison said quietly. "And more disturbingly, they've been planning for your incapacitation." I sat back in the leather chair, feeling suddenly cold despite the warm morning sun streaming through the office windows. This wasn't just theft. This was the systematic destruction of my independence, orchestrated by the child I had raised, supported, and loved unconditionally. "What evidence do we have?" I asked, my forensic training overriding my maternal shock. Morrison smiled, the first genuine expression I'd seen from him. "That's exactly what Harold said you would ask. He told me, when Eleanor hears this, she won't cry. She'll want to see the evidence and plan the counterattack." For the next 2 hours, Morrison walked me through a comprehensive investigation that revealed the depth of David's deception. Bank records showing forged signatures, email communications with his business partner Marcus Chen detailing their timeline, and most damaging of all, a recorded conversation where David discussed Mom's inevitable decline and the need to act quickly before she realizes what's happening. Harold had been secretly recording conversations during family visits, using a small device hidden in his bedside table. On the recordings, I could hear my son discussing my future as if I were already gone, making plans for my house, my investments, even my personal belongings. "There's something else," Morrison said, hesitating for the first time. "We have reason to believe David has been researching assisted living facilities, not the nice ones he's probably shown you brochures for, but state-funded institutions with minimal oversight, places where residents' assets are easier to manage." The implications were clear. David wasn't just planning to steal my money. He was planning to warehouse me somewhere I couldn't interfere with his plans. I left Morrison's office with copies of everything, a clear understanding of the legal options available to me, and a burning determination that surprised me with its intensity. Harold had given me more than evidence. He'd given me the foundation for justice. My next stop was lunch with Janet Rivera at a small cafe where we'd shared countless meals during our years working together in corporate investigations. Janet had aged gracefully, her silver hair and laugh lines testament to a career spent solving puzzles that others gave up on. "Eleanor, I heard about Harold. I'm so sorry," she said, embracing me with the warmth of genuine friendship. "But when you called yesterday, something in your voice told me this wasn't just a social visit." I spread the documents across our table, watching Janet's expression shift from sympathy to professional fascination as she absorbed the scope of David's deception. "This is sophisticated," she said after 20 minutes of silent reading. "Your son didn't develop this strategy alone. The business partner, Marcus Chen, I'll need to run a background check, but this level of planning suggests experience with elder financial abuse." Janet's expertise in financial crimes had always impressed me, but seeing her analyze my personal situation with the same precision she'd once applied to corporate fraud cases was both comforting and unsettling. "What's your timeline?" she asked. "David wants to move quickly. He's scheduled another visit tomorrow to help me organize more of Harold's papers. I suspect he's looking for documents that Harold hid from him." Janet nodded thoughtfully. "Classic mistake. He's operating under the assumption that you're vulnerable and isolated. He doesn't realize he's dealing with someone who spent decades catching people exactly like him." We spent the rest of lunch developing a strategy that would allow me to gather additional evidence while appearing to cooperate with David's plans. Janet would begin investigating Marcus Chen and any other associates, while I would document every interaction, every suggestion, every attempt to manipulate my decisions. "Remember," Janet said as we prepared to leave, "the most dangerous moment will be when he realizes you know what he's done. Men like David don't just give up when confronted. They escalate." Driving home in Harold's Mercedes, the car David was so eager for me to sell, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my retirement, the thrill of a complex investigation beginning to unfold. For 25 years, I'd been the woman corporations called when they suspected internal theft, when they needed someone who could follow financial trails that others couldn't see. Now I was using those same skills to investigate my own son. And what I was discovering would either save my future or destroy my family forever. But as I pulled into my driveway, I realized that David had already made that choice for me. The only question now was whether I had the strength to see this through to its conclusion. The answer came to me as I sat in the garage, in Harold's seat, surrounded by the scent of his cologne and the weight of his final gift to me, the truth. I had spent my entire career proving that no one was too clever to be caught, no scheme too sophisticated to be unraveled. David was about to learn that lesson in the most personal way possible. David arrived the next morning with coffee from my favorite bakery and that practiced smile that I now recognized as manipulation disguised as affection. But this time, I was ready for him. Hidden in my sweater pocket was a small recording device that Janet had provided, and positioned strategically around Harold's study were 3 additional audio recorders that looked like everyday objects: a pen holder, a picture frame, and a decorative paperweight that Harold had used for the same purpose. "I brought your favorite blueberry muffins, Mom," David said, settling into the chair across from Harold's desk with the familiarity of someone who'd done this many times before. "I thought we could tackle Dad's business files today. You mentioned yesterday that you couldn't remember where he put everything." "That's so thoughtful of you," I replied, deliberately fumbling with the coffee lid to appear frail and scattered. "I've been feeling so confused about everything since the funeral." David's eyes lit up with what I now understood was anticipation, not concern. "That's completely normal, Mom. Grief affects memory, decision-making, all kinds of cognitive functions. It's why Susan and I think it's so important to get your affairs organized now, while you have support." For the next hour, I watched my son systematically search through Harold's files with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. He paid particular attention to anything related to investment accounts, insurance policies, and legal documents. "Mom, I can't find Dad's copy of your wills anywhere," he said, not quite successfully hiding his frustration. "And there are gaps in the bank statements. Are you sure he didn't move important documents somewhere else?" "Harold was so secretive toward the end," I said, allowing genuine sadness to color my voice. "He would spend hours in here, moving papers around, muttering about making sure everything was properly organized." I never knew what he meant. This was partially true. Harold had been secretive, but not in the way David imagined. Did he ever mention other lawyers? Or safety deposit boxes? David pressed, leaning forward with an intensity that would have seemed caring to someone who didn't know what I now knew. There might be something, I said hesitantly, as if the memory was just surfacing. He did give me a key before he died, said it was for emergencies only. I put it somewhere safe, but I can't remember where. David's entire posture changed. What kind of key, Mom? A small one. Silver. It had numbers on it, but I don't remember what they were. I was watching David's face carefully, using skills I'd developed interrogating corporate executives who thought they were smarter than the evidence against them. The micro-expressions were telling. Excitement, calculation, and something that looked disturbingly like greed. Maybe we should look for that key, he suggested, his voice carefully casual. Dad might have left important documents that we need to handle your finances properly. 20 minutes later, David was helping me search through drawers and jewelry boxes with the dedication of someone looking for buried treasure, which, in a sense, he was. Here it is, I exclaimed, pulling the safety deposit box key from a jewelry box where I'd hidden it that morning. Number 2746. I remember now. Harold said something about First National Bank. David's hand trembled slightly as he examined the key. This could be really important, Mom. Dad might have put your most valuable documents here for safekeeping. We should go to the bank today, while everything is still fresh in your memory. The irony was breathtaking. David was eagerly helping me access the very evidence that would destroy him. An hour later, we were sitting in a sterile conference room at First National Bank, while a pleasant bank employee verified my identity and brought us the contents of box 2746. David's eyes were fixed on the metal box with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Would you like privacy to examine the contents? The employee asked. No need, I said quickly. David is helping me with everything now that Harold is gone. The box contained exactly what Harold had promised. 3 years of meticulously organized evidence. Bank statements with highlighted discrepancies, copies of forged documents, printed emails, and a thick folder labeled David's Business Partnership, Marcus Chen Investigation. I watched David's face as he processed what he was seeing. The confident mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. Mom, this is... He started, then stopped, clearly trying to formulate a response that wouldn't incriminate him. Harold was always so thorough, I said softly, leafing through documents that showed unauthorized transfers totaling $243,000. Look, he even kept track of every transaction, such attention to detail. David's breathing had changed. These documents, some of these transactions, they might not be what they appear to be. What do you mean? I asked, looking at him with the wide-eyed confusion of a woman who trusted her son completely. Sometimes banks make errors, or there are legitimate explanations for transfers that might look suspicious to someone who doesn't understand financial management. I nodded as if this made perfect sense, all while memorizing every word for the recording devices I was wearing. You're so smart about these things, David. Harold always said you had a good head for business. But as we drove home, I could see David's mind working furiously. He made several phone calls, speaking in low tones that he thought I couldn't hear. The fragments I caught were telling. We have a problem. She found the box. Need to accelerate the timeline. Yes, all of it. That evening, after David left with promises to help me understand the documents we'd found, I received a call that changed everything. Mrs. Whitmore, this is Detective Sarah Martinez with the Financial Crimes Division. Thomas Morrison contacted our department about your situation. Based on the evidence you've uncovered, we'd like to discuss the possibility of working together to build a formal case against your son. For a moment I couldn't speak. This was no longer just about recovering stolen money or protecting myself from future abuse. This was about justice in the truest sense. Detective Martinez, I said finally. I spent 25 years as a forensic accountant. I helped prosecutors build cases against financial criminals. I never thought I'd be building one against my own son, but yes, I'd very much like to work with you. Mrs. Whitmore, there's something else you should know. Marcus Chen, your son's business partner, is already under investigation for elder financial abuse in 2 other cases. If we can prove your son's involvement in this broader pattern, we're looking at serious federal charges. After hanging up, I sat in Harold's study surrounded by the evidence of my son's betrayal and felt something I hadn't expected: relief. For months, I'd been isolated in my grief, unknowingly vulnerable to manipulation by the person I should have been able to trust most. But Harold had given me more than evidence. He'd given me the tools to fight back. And now I had allies who understood exactly what David had done and why it mattered. Tomorrow, Detective Martinez would begin coaching me on how to document David's next moves. Because there would be next moves. David had seen the evidence now, and men like him didn't just surrender when confronted with proof of their crimes. They got desperate, and desperate people made mistakes that forensic accountants were trained to catch. Can you imagine discovering that your own child has been systematically planning your financial destruction? If you're following my story, subscribe and tell me in the comments, have you ever experienced betrayal from someone you trusted completely? Detective Martinez arrived at my house the next morning disguised as a home health aide, complete with a medical bag and clipboard. The deception was necessary because David had begun driving past my house at irregular intervals, something I'd noticed but hadn't mentioned to anyone yet. "Mrs. Whitmore, what we're dealing with here is more extensive than we initially realized," she said, settling into Harold's study with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd investigated countless similar cases. "Marcus Chen isn't just your son's business partner. He's the architect of what we're calling the gentle transition scheme." She opened a laptop and showed me photographs of Chen with other middle-aged men and women, all professionally dressed, all smiling for the camera at what appeared to be a business conference. Chen runs seminars for adult children of aging parents, teaching them how to help their parents transition into appropriate care situations. On the surface, it looks like elder care consulting. In reality, it's a systematic approach to financial abuse that's been operating in 6 states. The scope of what I was seeing made my forensic accountant training kick into overdrive. This wasn't just about David's greed. This was about a coordinated criminal enterprise that targeted families exactly like mine. "Your son paid Chen $15,000 for what they call the Comprehensive Family Transition Package," Martinez continued. "It includes psychological profiling of the target parent, legal strategies for gaining financial control, and most disturbingly, recommendations for care facilities that don't ask too many questions about how residents' assets are managed." She showed me a document that made my blood run cold. A detailed psychological assessment of me, written by Chen based on information David had provided. It described me as increasingly fragile, prone to confusion, emotionally dependent on deceased spouse, likely to accept guidance from authority figures. "They had me completely profiled," I said, reading my own supposed psychological weaknesses laid out like a battle plan. "The profile is actually what's going to help us catch them," Martinez replied, "because it's all based on your son's assumptions about who you are. He never told Chen that you're a forensic accountant with 25 years of experience catching financial criminals." Over the next 2 hours, Martinez walked me through the full scope of the investigation. Chen's operation had successfully targeted 47 families over 3 years, with total financial damages exceeding $3 million. Most victims never realized what had happened to them until it was too late to recover their assets. "Your husband's evidence is unprecedented," Martinez explained. "Most victims don't have documentation this comprehensive. Harold essentially handed us a complete case file." But as we talked, Martinez's expression grew increasingly serious. "Mrs. Whitmore, there's something else. We believe your son is planning to escalate his timeline dramatically. Phone intercepts suggest he's concerned about your access to the evidence, and he's scheduled a meeting with Chen for tomorrow." "What kind of escalation?" "Based on patterns we've seen in other cases, when adult children in this scheme feel threatened, they often push for immediate legal action. Emergency guardianship petitions, claims of parental incompetence, sometimes even involuntary psychiatric holds." The words hit me like ice water. David wasn't just planning to steal my money. He was planning to have me declared legally incompetent and institutionalized. "How long do we have?" I asked. "Possibly days." Chen's typical advice when clients feel exposed is to act immediately, before the parent can mount any defense. Martinez leaned forward, her expression intense. "Mrs. Whitmore, I need to ask you something difficult. Are you prepared to let this play out in a way that will give us enough evidence to prosecute not just your son, but Chen's entire operation?" I understood what she was asking. To catch them completely, I would need to allow David to make his move, to actually attempt to have me declared incompetent while we documented every step of the process. What would that involve? You'd need to continue appearing vulnerable while secretly working with us to record conversations, document meetings, and gather evidence of the conspiracy. It's dangerous because if David realizes what you're doing, he could accelerate to desperate measures. I thought about Harold's final months, how he'd endured the pain of discovering his son's betrayal while maintaining the facade of ignorance. He'd done it to protect me, to give me the tools I'd need to fight back. Detective Martinez, my husband died knowing that our son was stealing from us, planning to destroy my independence, and potentially planning to have me locked away in some terrible institution. He spent his final months building a case instead of confronting the betrayal directly. I won't let his sacrifice be wasted. Are you sure? This kind of undercover work is psychologically difficult even for trained officers. Watching your own son try to destroy your life while pretending to love you, it takes a particular kind of strength. I looked around Harold's study, at the books we'd read together, the photographs of family vacations when David was young, and I believed he loved me unconditionally. Then I looked at the evidence of his systematic betrayal spread across the desk. Detective, I spent 25 years catching people who thought they were smarter than the evidence against them. I helped put away executives who stole pension funds, accountants who embezzled millions, and financial advisors who defrauded elderly clients. I never thought I'd be investigating my own son, but the principles are the same. Martinez nodded slowly. Then here's what we're going to do. The plan she outlined was both simple and terrifying. I would continue playing the role of the confused, grieving widow while wearing recording devices to every interaction with David. Martinez would have agents monitoring my house around the clock, disguised as neighbors, utility workers, and delivery drivers. When David made his move to have me declared incompetent, we'd have documentation of every step of the conspiracy. There's one more thing, Martinez said as she prepared to leave. We need you to call David today and tell him you've been thinking about what he said regarding managing your finances. Act like you're ready to sign documents giving him power of attorney. Won't that be dangerous? Only if he realizes you know what the documents actually do. But based on Chen's methodology, David will want to have everything signed before filing any legal petitions. It gives us time to document the fraud before he can use the documents against you. After Martinez left, I sat alone in the study and made the most difficult phone call of my life. David, it's Mom. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday about helping with my finances. Oh, Mom, I'm so glad you called. His voice carried genuine warmth that I now recognized as relief. Susan and I have been worried about you trying to handle everything alone. I think you were right. I need help. Could you come over this evening? Maybe bring some of those documents you mentioned. Of course, Mom. I'll bring everything we need to get your affairs properly organized. As I hung up, I realized that in 24 hours, my son would arrive at my house with documents designed to strip me of my legal rights, my financial independence, and my freedom. He would ask me to sign papers that would give him complete control over my life, believing that I was too confused and grief-stricken to understand what I was agreeing to. He was wrong about my confusion. But he was right about one thing. Tomorrow would change everything between us forever. The difference was that this time, I would be the one controlling how the story ended. The morning of what I now thought of as Document Day began with meticulous preparation. Detective Martinez and her technical team had spent 2 hours the previous evening turning my home into what she called a recording studio disguised as a living room. Hidden cameras were positioned in the study, living room, and kitchen, anywhere David might ask me to sign documents. The recording devices were so sophisticated that they could capture conversations through walls, meaning every word David said, even in whispered phone calls, would be preserved as evidence. Remember, Mrs. Whitmore, your job is to be exactly what your son expects, confused, overwhelmed, and grateful for his help, Martinez reminded me during our final briefing. Let him explain the documents to you. Ask questions that a worried, trusting mother would ask. Make him spell out exactly what each signature means. She handed me a small device that looked like a hearing aid. This will let you hear us if you need guidance. One of our agents will be monitoring from the van across the street. If you feel unsafe at any point, just touch your left earring twice and we'll intervene immediately. But what Martinez didn't know was that I'd spent the previous evening doing my own preparation. 25 years of investigating financial crimes had taught me that the best defense against sophisticated fraud was to understand it completely. I'd studied every document in Harold's evidence collection, researched Chen's operation online, and prepared questions that would force David to explain his entire scheme while thinking he was manipulating a confused elderly woman. At 3 o'clock, David arrived with Susan and a leather briefcase that looked expensive and official. Susan carried a bouquet of flowers and wore the kind of sympathetic expression that funeral directors perfect. "Eleanor, you look tired," Susan said, embracing me with arms that felt like they were assessing my physical frailty. "We're so proud of you for asking for help. It takes wisdom to recognize when you need support." David had organized the documents with the precision of someone who'd done this before. Powers of attorney, bank authorization forms, property transfer documents, and what appeared to be applications for transitional care evaluation, a phrase that made my skin crawl. "Mom, I know this seems overwhelming, but everything here is designed to protect you," David said, settling beside me on the couch with a tone that was both patronizing and affectionate. "Let me walk you through each document so you understand exactly what we're doing." For the next hour, I watched my son systematically explain how he was going to strip me of every legal right I possessed. He presented each document as protection, each signature as a gift I was giving myself. This power of attorney form means that if you ever become confused or unable to make decisions, I can handle your finances immediately without having to go through complicated legal processes, he explained, pointing to signature lines that would give him complete control over my assets. "What kind of decisions?" I asked, deliberately sounding uncertain. "Oh, simple things. Paying bills, managing investments, making sure your accounts are properly organized. You wouldn't have to worry about any of the complicated financial details." I nodded, as if this made perfect sense, while internally cataloging every misleading statement for the recording devices. "And this other document? That's a healthcare directive. It just says that if doctors ever think you need additional support, maybe in a nice assisted living community, I can help you make those decisions without delays that might affect your care." The euphemisms were masterful. David never mentioned that the healthcare directive would allow him to commit me to an institution against my will, or that the transitional care evaluation was the first step toward having me declared legally incompetent. "David, this is so much to understand," I said, allowing my voice to waver slightly. "Are you sure all of this is necessary?" "Mom, look at me," he said, taking my hands with what appeared to be genuine emotion. "I'm your son. I love you. Everything I'm doing is to make sure you're safe and protected. Dad would want me to take care of you." The mention of Harold nearly broke my carefully maintained composure. David was invoking his father's memory to justify the very betrayal that Harold had died trying to expose. "I just want to make sure I understand everything," I said, picking up the power of attorney document again. "This means you can access my bank accounts?" "Only to help you, Mom. To make sure bills are paid, investments are properly managed, that sort of thing. And you can make decisions about where I live? Only if doctors think you need additional support. And only to make sure you get the best possible care." Susan leaned forward with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Eleanor, you raised such a wonderful son. You're so lucky to have David looking out for you." As David prepared the documents for my signature, I noticed something that my forensic training recognized immediately. Several of the forms had been pre-filled with information I hadn't provided. Account numbers, property details, and medical information that David shouldn't have had access to without my consent. "David, how did you know my account number at Merchants Bank?" I asked, pointing to a pre-filled line on one of the forms. For just a moment, his composed expression flickered. "Dad must have mentioned it, or maybe I saw it on one of the statements we looked through yesterday." But I knew that wasn't true. The Merchants Bank account was one Harold had kept separate, one that David had never had any legitimate reason to know about. The pre-filled information was evidence of prior unauthorized access, more proof of the systematic nature of his theft. "Should I sign everything now?" I asked, reaching for a pen with hands that I made sure trembled slightly. "That would be perfect, Mom. Then everything will be properly organized, and you won't have to worry about any of these complicated details." As I held the pen over the first document, I thought about Harold lying in his hospital bed, discovering that his son was stealing from us, planning to destroy my independence, and preparing to have me institutionalized. I thought about the months of secret investigation he'd conducted while pretending not to know what David was doing. But I also thought about Detective Martinez and her team, recording every word, documenting every lie, building the case that would bring down not just David, but Chen's entire criminal enterprise. I signed the first document, then the second, watching David's face relax with what he thought was victory. With each signature, I was giving him exactly what he needed to destroy my legal rights, and exactly what the police needed to destroy him. "There," I said, setting down the pen and smiling at my son with all the trust and love I'd felt for him before I learned who he really was. "I feel so much better knowing you're taking care of everything." David gathered the documents with hands that shook slightly from excitement. "You did the right thing, Mom. Dad would be so proud of how brave you're being." After they left, promising to take care of all the filing and processing, I sat alone in my living room and allowed myself to feel the full weight of what I'd just done. I'd signed documents that legally gave my son the power to control every aspect of my life, trusting that Detective Martinez and her team would prevent him from using them. But more than that, I'd watched my only child explain to me exactly how he planned to destroy my freedom while believing he was manipulating a helpless old woman who trusted him completely. Tomorrow, David would file those documents and begin the process of having me declared incompetent, and when he did, the police would have everything they needed to arrest him for conspiracy, fraud, and elder abuse. The trap was set. Now we just had to wait for David to spring it on himself. The morning after signing the documents felt different, charged with the electricity that comes before a storm breaks. I knew David would move quickly now. Men like him always did when they thought victory was within reach. Detective Martinez called at 8 o'clock sharp. Mrs. Whitmore, our surveillance team recorded David making several phone calls after leaving your house yesterday. He's scheduled a meeting with Chen this morning, and he's contacted 3 different attorneys about expedited guardianship proceedings. How long do we have? Based on similar cases, probably 48 to 72 hours before he files the first legal motions. But there's something else. Chen is bringing someone new to their meeting today, someone we haven't identified yet. I felt a chill run down my spine. Another victim's child? Possibly. Or someone higher up in the organization. "We're going to need you to do something that might feel dangerous." Martinez explained that they needed me to visit David at his office, ostensibly to ask questions about the documents I'd signed, but actually to record any conversations he might have about next steps in their plan. The recording device will be built into a purse that looks exactly like one you already own. If David's meeting with Chen is still happening when you arrive, we'll have audio of their entire planning session. An hour later, I was driving Harold's Mercedes toward David's office building, wearing a wire sophisticated enough to pick up conversations through walls. The irony wasn't lost on me. David wanted me to sell this car because he thought it represented independence I no longer needed. Instead, it was carrying me toward the evidence that would destroy his plans. David's office occupied the 10th floor of a downtown building that had always impressed me with its marble lobby and expensive artwork. Today, it felt like enemy territory. "Mom!" David's assistant Jennifer looked genuinely pleased to see me. "David mentioned you might be stopping by. He's in a meeting right now, but he should be free in about 20 minutes. "Oh, I can wait," I said, settling into a chair in the reception area that happened to be positioned perfectly to overhear conversations from David's office. I just had a few questions about those papers I signed yesterday. For the next 15 minutes, I listened through hidden speakers as David, Chen, and a third man discussed what they called Phase 3 implementation. The details made my blood run cold. "Eleanor Whitmore signed all necessary documents yesterday," David was saying. "Power of attorney, healthcare directives, property authorizations, everything we discussed." Chen's voice was clinical, businesslike. "Excellent. I've scheduled the psychological evaluation for Friday. Dr. Kellerman understands the parameters we need." "And if she resists the evaluation?" the third voice asked. "She won't," David replied with confidence that made me sick. "She's been increasingly confused since Dad died. The grief has affected her judgment significantly." "What about the timeline for placement?" Chen asked. "Sunny Acres has a room available Monday. Once we have Dr. Kellerman's report documenting her diminished capacity, we can have her transferred immediately. I gripped the arms of my chair to keep from shaking. Sunny Acres was the state-funded facility Martinez had mentioned, the place where residents' assets disappeared into administrative fees and care costs that somehow never improved the actual care. And the financial transfers? The third voice pressed. I've already begun liquidating the smaller accounts, David said. Once she's placed and I have full guardianship, the house sale can proceed immediately. Conservative estimate puts the total asset value at $1.8 million. $1.8 million. They weren't just planning to steal my independence. They were planning to steal everything Harold and I had built over 43 years of marriage. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, covering details about forged medical records, bribes to facility administrators, and strategies for preventing me from contacting outside help once I was institutionalized. When David finally emerged from his office, his face lit up with what I now recognized as performed affection. "Mom! What a wonderful surprise," he said, embracing me while Chen and the third man, a doctor based on their conversation, watched from the doorway. "Jennifer said you had questions about yesterday's documents?" "Just a few small things," I said, allowing my voice to sound slightly confused. "I was wondering when those papers would take effect." "Don't worry about the technical details, Mom. Everything is being processed properly." David's tone was patient but dismissive. "Is there anything specific you're concerned about?" "Well, I was talking to my neighbor Helen this morning, and she mentioned that her daughter had her sign similar papers, and then there were some complications with her bank accounts." I watched David's face carefully as I mentioned complications. The micro-expression of alarm was brief, but unmistakable. "What kind of complications?" he asked, too casually. "Oh, probably nothing important. Something about not being able to access her own money for a while. But Helen gets confused sometimes." David exchanged a quick glance with Chen, who had moved closer to our conversation. "Mom, every situation is different. Helen's daughter probably didn't work with qualified professionals like we have. You won't experience any of those problems." "That's such a relief," I said, smiling with genuine gratitude that David interpreted as naive trust rather than satisfaction at his incriminating statements. As I prepared to leave, Chen approached me with the kind of professional warmth that had probably convinced dozens of families to trust him with their futures. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm Marcus Chen. David's told me so much about you. I just want you to know how fortunate you are to have a son who cares so deeply about your well-being." "Oh, you're Marcus. David talks about you all the time. You've been such a help during this difficult transition." Chen's smile was perfectly calibrated, sympathetic but confident, the expression of someone who'd built a career on appearing trustworthy while systematically destroying families. "David mentioned that you might benefit from a consultation with one of our care specialists. Just a friendly conversation about resources available to help you adjust to life without Harold." "That sounds wonderful," I replied, knowing that this consultation was actually the psychological evaluation designed to have me declared incompetent. "Perfect. Dr. Kellerman is excellent with recently widowed clients. I'll have David schedule something for Friday if that works for you." Driving home, I called Detective Martinez from the car using a hands-free device that allowed her to monitor the call in case David was having me followed. "We got everything," I told her. "The timeline, the financial projections, the name of the facility, even the doctor who's going to falsify the psychological evaluation. Mrs. Whitmore, what you've done today will help us prosecute not just your son and Chen, but an entire network of professionals who've been preying on vulnerable elderly people. The evidence you've gathered is unprecedented. What happens now? Now we wait for them to make the first official move. Based on what you recorded today, David will probably file guardianship petitions Monday morning, right after he thinks the psychological evaluation has given him the documentation he needs. And Dr. Kellerman's evaluation on Friday will be the final piece of evidence we need to prove conspiracy to commit fraud. We'll have agents posing as office staff to record the entire session." That evening, I sat in Harold's study surrounded by months of evidence, knowing that in 72 hours, David would walk into a courtroom believing he was about to gain legal control over my life. Instead, he would find Detective Martinez waiting with federal arrest warrants for conspiracy, elder abuse, fraud, and participation in a criminal enterprise. Harold's final gift to me hadn't just been the evidence to protect myself. It had been the opportunity to protect other families from experiencing what we'd endured. But first, I had to survive one more performance, convincing Dr. Kellerman that I was the confused, vulnerable woman my son needed me to be. The hardest part wouldn't be fooling the doctor. The hardest part would be sitting in that office, listening to David describe my supposed mental decline, while maintaining the facade of the trusting mother he thought he was manipulating. Fortunately, I'd had 25 years of practice remaining calm while documenting other people's lies. Friday would just be the most personal case of my career. Friday morning arrived gray and cold, matching my mood as I prepared for what Detective Martinez had called the performance of your life. Dr. Kellerman's office was in a medical complex 20 minutes from my house, and David had insisted on driving me there himself. "I'm so proud of you for agreeing to this consultation, Mom," he said, as we pulled into the parking lot. "Dr. Kellerman specializes in helping people adjust to major life transitions. She's going to be so helpful." I nodded with the grateful confusion I'd perfected over the past week. "Will you be staying with me? I get nervous talking to doctors alone now." "Of course, Mom. I'll be right there to help you explain anything that's unclear." The recording devices I was wearing were the most sophisticated yet, nearly invisible microphones woven into my clothing, and a camera lens disguised as a decorative button that would capture everything happening in the room. Dr. Patricia Kellerman looked exactly like central casting would order for a corrupt psychiatrist, professional but cold, with the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. Her office was decorated with certificates and awards that were probably meant to inspire confidence, but instead felt like props in an elaborate stage set. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm so sorry for your loss," she said, gesturing to a chair positioned directly across from her desk. "David has told me how difficult this transition has been for you." "Thank you, Doctor. Everyone has been so kind since Harold passed." For the next hour, I submitted to the most manipulative psychological evaluation I could have imagined. Dr. Kellerman asked questions designed to elicit responses that could be interpreted as confusion, questions about dates and details that would be difficult for anyone to remember precisely, and questions about my emotional state that were clearly intended to establish mental instability. "Mrs. Whitmore, can you tell me what you had for breakfast 3 days ago?" When I hesitated, because who remembers breakfast from 3 days ago, she made notes that I was certain described memory problems. "Have you been feeling anxious or overwhelmed since your husband's death?" "Yes," I answered honestly. "Losing Harold has been very difficult." More notes, probably about depression affecting judgment. "David mentioned that you've been having trouble managing your finances. Can you walk me through your typical bill-paying process?" This was where David's strategy became clear. As I described the normal complexity of managing multiple accounts, investments, and household expenses, Dr. Kellerman framed every detail as evidence of cognitive overload. "That sounds quite complicated for someone in your situation," she said. "Many people your age find it helpful to simplify these responsibilities." The most chilling moment came when Dr. Kellerman began asking about my living situation. "David mentioned that you're living alone now in a large house. Do you ever feel unsafe or worried about managing such a big property by yourself?" "Sometimes," I admitted, "because any widow would feel that way." "Have you considered alternative living arrangements that might provide more support and security?" "David has mentioned some options," I said carefully. "How do you feel about the possibility of moving to a community where you'd have help with daily activities and wouldn't need to worry about home maintenance?" I could see David nodding encouragingly from his chair beside me, believing that I was being guided toward accepting institutionalization. I suppose if it were the right place, and David thought it was best, I let my voice trail off uncertainly. Dr. Kellerman's pen moved rapidly across her notepad. "It's wonderful that you have such a caring son to help you navigate these important decisions." But the most damaging part of the evaluation came when Dr. Kellerman began discussing my decision-making capacity directly. "Mrs. Whitmore, David mentioned that you recently signed some important documents. Can you tell me about that process?" "David brought papers that would help him take care of things for me. Financial things that are too complicated for me to handle alone now." "And you felt comfortable signing those documents?" David explained everything very carefully. He said it would protect me. "Did you read the documents yourself, or did you rely on David's explanations?" This was the trap. If I said I'd read them myself, she'd question my comprehension. If I said I'd relied on David's explanations, she'd document my inability to make independent decisions. David is so much smarter about these things than I am, I said. I trusted his judgment. More rapid note-taking, probably documenting my dependence on my son's guidance for major decisions. The evaluation concluded with Dr. Kellerman asking me to perform simple cognitive tests, remembering word lists, solving basic math problems, drawing geometric shapes. I answered everything correctly, but allowed myself to seem slightly uncertain, as if the effort was taxing. Mrs. Whitmore, thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Kellerman said as the session ended. I'll be preparing a report for David that includes some recommendations for additional support services that might be helpful for you. Will I need to come back? I asked. That won't be necessary. I have everything I need to provide David with a comprehensive assessment. As we left the office, David was practically glowing with satisfaction. How do you think that went, Mom? Dr. Kellerman was very nice. I hope I answered her questions correctly. You did perfectly, Mom. She's going to help us make sure you have all the support you need. During the drive home, David made several phone calls using his car's hands-free system, apparently forgetting that I could hear every word. Marcus, the evaluation went exactly as planned. She documented everything we discussed. Yes, cognitive decline consistent with grief-related depression. Dependency on family guidance for major decisions. I'll have the report Monday morning. Then a call to someone named Jim, who was apparently a lawyer. We'll be ready to file Wednesday. All documentation will be complete. No, she suspects nothing. The placement is already arranged. When we arrived at my house, David walked me to the door with the solicitous attention of someone who believed he was caring for an increasingly helpless parent. Mom, I'm going to be busy with some legal paperwork over the weekend, but I'll check in with you Monday. Is there anything you need before then? I'll be fine, David. Thank you for taking such good care of me. As soon as his car disappeared down the street, I called Detective Martinez. We have everything we need, she said, after I'd described the evaluation. Dr. Kellerman's report will be the final piece of evidence proving that this entire scheme was coordinated in advance. When David files those guardianship papers Wednesday, we'll have documented proof that every step was fraudulent. What happens now? Now we prepare for Wednesday. When David walks into that courthouse believing he's about to gain control of your life, he'll instead be walking into the biggest elder abuse bust in this state's history. That evening, I sat in my living room. The living room where I'd raised David, where we'd celebrated holidays and birthdays, where I'd comforted him through childhood disappointments and cheered his successes, and tried to reconcile the son I'd loved with the man who was systematically planning my destruction. Harold's voice seemed to echo from his favorite chair. Eleanor, some people show you who they really are through their actions, not their words. The question isn't whether David loves you. The question is whether his love is stronger than his greed. Wednesday would answer that question definitively, and based on everything I'd witnessed over the past week, I already knew what the answer would be. But knowing the truth and accepting it were two different things. Even after everything David had done, part of me still hoped that when faced with the choice between his mother's well-being and his financial gain, some vestige of the son I'd raised would choose love over money. Wednesday would prove whether that hope was justified, or whether Harold had been right to spend his final months building the case that would save me from our son's betrayal. Wednesday morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of spring day that should have been perfect for new beginnings rather than family destructions. I dressed carefully in a navy blue suit that projected both dignity and vulnerability, the image of a woman who deserved protection, not exploitation. Detective Martinez called at 7:30. Mrs. Whitmore, everything is in position. We have agents in the courthouse, David's office is under surveillance, and we've coordinated with the judge who's been assigned to hear the guardianship petition. Are you ready for this? As ready as I can be to watch my son try to legally destroy my life, I replied, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. Remember, you won't be alone in that courtroom. Judge Harrison has been briefed on our investigation. The moment David presents his fraudulent evidence, we'll intervene. At 10:45, I received the call I'd been expecting. Mom, I need you to come to the courthouse. David's voice carried a tone of manufactured urgency. There's been a minor legal complication with Dad's estate, and the judge needs to ask you a few questions. What kind of complication? I asked, injecting just the right amount of worry into my voice. Nothing serious, just some paperwork issues. I'll meet you there and handle everything. You don't need to worry about any of the details. The courthouse was the imposing granite building that had always represented justice to me. Today, it felt like a battleground where my future would be decided by lies masquerading as legal documents. David met me at the security checkpoint, carrying the leather briefcase that had become a symbol of his deception. His smile was confident, almost triumphant. This should be very quick, Mom. Just a few questions from the judge, and then we can get everything properly sorted out. We took the elevator to the 3rd floor, where family court cases were heard. David guided me into a small courtroom where several people were already seated. A court reporter, a bailiff, and a woman in a business suit who David introduced as Ms. Patterson, the court-appointed advocate who'll be helping us today. What David didn't mention was that Ms. Patterson was actually Detective Martinez's partner, Agent Sarah Chen, working undercover as part of the federal investigation. Judge Harrison was a silver-haired woman in her early 60s who looked at me with the kind of professional compassion that judges develop over decades of family court cases. What David couldn't see from his position was the slight nod she gave me, a signal that she understood exactly what was about to happen. Mrs. Whitmore, please have a seat, Judge Harrison said gently. I understand that your son has filed a petition regarding your ability to manage your own affairs. Your Honor, David began, standing with the practiced confidence of someone who believed his plan was working perfectly. My mother has been experiencing significant cognitive decline since my father's death 6 months ago. Dr. Kellerman's evaluation, which I've submitted to the court, documents clear evidence of depression-related memory loss and an inability to make informed decisions about complex financial matters. He opened his briefcase and presented the forged documents I'd signed, Dr. Kellerman's fraudulent psychological report, and medical records that had been altered to suggest cognitive impairment. Mrs. Whitmore has already signed documents acknowledging her need for assistance, and I've identified an appropriate care facility where she'll receive the support she needs while her assets are properly managed. Judge Harrison examined the documents with the careful attention that family court judges give to cases involving elderly people's rights. Mr. Whitmore, these are serious allegations. Your mother would be surrendering fundamental legal rights based on this petition. Yes, Your Honor, but it's for her own protection. She's no longer capable of making these decisions independently. Mrs. Whitmore, Judge Harrison turned to me. How do you feel about your son's petition? This was the moment I'd been rehearsing for days. I needed to appear confused and vulnerable while setting the stage for what was about to happen. I trust David's judgment, Your Honor. He says this is what's best for me. And you signed these documents willingly? David explained everything to me. I may not understand all the details, but I know he loves me and wants to protect me. Judge Harrison nodded sympathetically, then looked directly at David. Mr. Whitmore, I have some concerns about the timeline of these documents. Your mother signed powers of attorney just days after visiting a safety deposit box that contained evidence of significant financial irregularities in your family's accounts. David's confident expression flickered slightly. I'm not sure what you mean, Your Honor. Bank records show that someone has been making unauthorized withdrawals from your parents' accounts for over 2 years. The signatures on some of these transactions appear to be forged. The color began draining from David's face. Your Honor, I think there may be some confusion about routine account management that my father authorized before his death. Mr. Whitmore, did your father authorize you to transfer $243,000 to accounts controlled by Marcus Chen? The question hit David like a physical blow. His mouth opened and closed without sound, the practiced confidence evaporating as he realized that his carefully constructed deception was collapsing. Your Honor, I can explain those transactions. I'm sure you can, Mr. Whitmore. In fact, I'd like you to explain them to Detective Martinez of the Financial Crimes Division. On cue, Detective Martinez entered the courtroom, followed by 2 federal agents and Marcus Chen in handcuffs. David turned toward the door, his face now completely white as he saw his business partner being escorted into the courtroom as a defendant rather than a conspirator. David Whitmore, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit elder abuse, financial fraud, and participation in a criminal enterprise, Detective Martinez announced, approaching him with handcuffs of her own. "This is a mistake," David said, his voice rising with panic. "I was protecting my mother. Everything I did was to help her." Judge Harrison looked at him with the kind of stern disappointment that only family court judges can master. "Mr. Whitmore, we have recordings of you planning your mother's institutionalization, discussing the liquidation of her assets, and coordinating with Dr. Kellerman to falsify a psychological evaluation. Your mother wasn't the confused elderly woman you thought you were manipulating. She was the forensic accountant who helped build the case against you." The moment David realized what had happened was one I'll remember for the rest of my life. His eyes met mine across the courtroom, and for the first time in months, I saw the real David. Not the manipulative son who'd been stealing from his parents, but the confused and desperate man who'd convinced himself that his greed was actually love. "Mom?" he said, his voice breaking as the handcuffs clicked into place. "I spent 25 years catching people who thought they were smarter than the evidence against them," I said quietly. "I never thought one of them would be my son." As the bailiff led David from the courtroom, he looked back at me with an expression that was part anger, part disbelief, and part something that might have been remorse. But it was too late for remorse. The damage had been done, the choices had been made, and the consequences were just beginning. Judge Harrison dismissed the fraudulent guardianship petition and ordered all of David's powers of attorney to be voided immediately. My legal rights were restored, my financial independence was protected, and my freedom was secure. But as I left the courthouse that day, I realized that while I had won the legal battle, I had lost something that could never be recovered: the son I thought I knew and the family I thought I had. The federal investigation that followed David's arrest unraveled Marcus Chen's criminal enterprise with the precision of a forensic audit. What we discovered in the weeks after the courthouse confrontation was far more extensive than even Detective Martinez had initially suspected. Chen's operation, which they called Sunset Solutions, had been systematically targeting affluent elderly individuals across 6 states for over 4 years. The scheme was sophisticated beyond anything I'd encountered in my decades as a forensic accountant. A coordinated network of corrupt doctors, lawyers, care facility administrators, and adult children who'd been recruited and trained to exploit their own parents. David wasn't just a criminal. He was a graduate of Chen's comprehensive program. "Mrs. Whitmore, your son paid Chen $25,000 for what they called the Premium Family Transition Package," Detective Martinez explained during one of our regular briefings at the federal building. "It included psychological profiling techniques, legal document preparation, and ongoing coaching on how to manipulate elderly parents into compliance. The evidence they'd collected painted a picture of David that I was still struggling to accept. For over 18 months, he'd been attending monthly seminars where Chen taught adult children how to identify their parents' psychological vulnerabilities, how to isolate them from outside support, and how to systematically transfer assets while maintaining the appearance of loving concern. He wasn't acting alone or improvising," Martinez continued. "Every conversation you recorded, every document he presented, every manipulation tactic he used, it was all part of a detailed script that Chen had developed and refined over years of victimizing families. The most damaging evidence came from Chen's own files, seized when federal agents raided his offices. David's case folder contained detailed psychological assessments of both Harold and me, strategic timelines coordinated with Harold's medical prognosis, and financial projections that treated our life savings like a business acquisition. But what broke my heart completely was a document titled Eleanor Whitmore, Resistance Potential Assessment. Chen had evaluated my likely responses to various manipulation tactics and concluded that my professional background in financial investigation represented a moderate risk factor that could be mitigated through emotional manipulation and controlled information access. They had studied me like a problem to be solved. The scope of the criminal enterprise became clear as other victims began coming forward. 47 families had been targeted over 4 years, with total financial damages exceeding $4.2 million. Most victims had never realized what happened to them. They'd been successfully convinced that their confusion, their financial difficulties, and their eventual institutionalization were natural consequences of aging rather than the results of coordinated criminal activity. I testified before a federal grand jury for 6 hours, walking prosecutors through the evidence Harold had gathered, describing the psychological manipulation techniques David had used, and explaining the forensic accounting methods that had helped us document the systematic theft. Mrs. Whitmore, the lead prosecutor, asked, "In your professional opinion, could your son have developed this scheme independently?" "Absolutely not," I replied. The level of coordination, the sophistication of the document forgeries, the psychological manipulation techniques, this required professional training and ongoing support. David isn't smart enough to have conceived this alone, and he isn't disciplined enough to have executed it without guidance. It was painful to say that about my son, but it was also the truth. The federal trial began 3 months later, with Chen, David, Dr. Kellerman, and 12 other conspirators facing charges ranging from elder abuse to racketeering. The prosecution's case was built largely on the evidence Harold had gathered and the recordings I'd made during my week of undercover work. David's defense attorney tried to portray him as a loving son who'd been manipulated by Chen into believing he was protecting his mother. It was a strategy that might have worked if not for the recordings where David discussed my inevitable decline and calculated the profits from liquidating my assets. The most devastating moment of the trial came when prosecutors played the recording of David and Chen discussing my placement at Sunny Acres. Once Eleanor is institutionalized, how quickly can we liquidate the property assets? David's voice filled the courtroom. Conservative timeline would be 60 days for the house sale, another 30 for investment liquidation, Chen replied. Total asset recovery should exceed $1.8 million. And her monthly care costs at Sunny Acres? Approximately $4,000 monthly. At that rate, with proper asset management, we're looking at a 15 to 20-year revenue stream before the estate is depleted. The jury listened to my son discussing my lifespan in terms of profit margins. Several jurors visibly recoiled when David's voice continued. 20 years seems optimistic. Most residents at Sunny Acres don't last more than 5 to 7 years once the isolation and medication protocols take effect. He had been planning not just my financial destruction, but my gradual murder through institutional neglect. When David took the stand in his own defense, I saw him clearly for perhaps the first time in years. Not as my son, not as the child I'd raised and loved, but as the man he'd chosen to become. His testimony was a masterpiece of self-justification and misdirection. "I was trying to protect my mother from her own confusion," he told the jury. "After Dad died, she couldn't manage basic financial decisions. I was afraid she'd be taken advantage of by strangers, so I tried to help." "Mr. Whitmore," the prosecutor asked during cross-examination, "was transferring $243,000 to accounts controlled by Marcus Chen, part of protecting your mother? That money was invested to generate income for her care. And planning to have her declared incompetent and institutionalized against her will? She needed professional care that I couldn't provide at home. Mr. Whitmore, we have recordings of you discussing your mother's life expectancy in terms of profit margins. How was that protecting her?" For the first time during his testimony, David's composure cracked. "You don't understand the pressure I was under. Dad was dying, Mom was falling apart, and I had my own family to think about. Sometimes you have to make difficult decisions. Difficult decisions like stealing from your dying father and planning to institutionalize your mother for profit. I never meant for it to go that far," David said, his voice breaking. "Chen said it would be temporary, just until Mom adjusted to life without Dad. I thought." "You thought what, Mr. Whitmore?" "I thought she'd die before she realized what we'd done." The courtroom fell completely silent. David had just admitted that his entire scheme was predicated on the assumption that I would die of grief or neglect before I could discover his betrayal. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. David was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Chen received 18 years, and Dr. Kellerman lost her medical license along with a 7-year sentence. But as I sat in that courtroom watching my son being led away in shackles, I realized that the legal victory felt hollow. Justice had been served, my financial security was protected, and other families would be safe from Chen's predatory enterprise. Yet I had lost my son, not to death, which I could have grieved and eventually accepted, but to greed and moral corruption, which left me with questions that would never be answered and pain that would never fully heal. The boy I'd raised, the man I'd loved unconditionally, had chosen to see me as an obstacle to be removed rather than a mother to be cherished. And that choice had destroyed not just my trust, but the very possibility of redemption. The months following David's sentencing were strange and disorienting, like living in a house where familiar rooms had been rearranged while I slept. My legal rights were restored, my financial assets were secure, and my independence was protected. But the emotional landscape of my life had been permanently altered. Susan filed for divorce 3 weeks after David's conviction, claiming she'd been unaware of his criminal activities. The federal investigation proved otherwise. Bank records showed that Susan had been receiving regular transfers from the accounts David had been draining, and her signature appeared on several suspicious documents. Mrs. Whitmore, we found evidence that Susan was not only aware of David's activities, but actively participated in planning your institutionalization, Detective Martinez informed me during our final official meeting. She's accepted a plea agreement in exchange for her testimony, but she'll serve 18 months in federal prison. My daughter-in-law, who'd embraced me with such theatrical warmth while discussing my need for appropriate care, had been calculating her share of my liquidated assets even as she expressed concern for my well-being. But the most devastating revelation came when federal investigators uncovered the full extent of Harold's secret investigation. My husband hadn't just discovered David's theft in his final months. He'd been aware of suspicious activity for over 2 years before his death. Harold hired a private investigator 14 months before he died, Thomas Morrison explained when I met with him to review the complete case file. He suspected something was wrong but hoped he could handle it within the family. It wasn't until David accelerated his activities during Harold's final illness that your husband realized the full scope of what was happening. Morrison showed me photographs Harold had commissioned, images of David meeting with Chen, entering banks where our accounts were held, and visiting properties that Harold knew we'd never discussed purchasing. Your husband spent the last year of his life torn between his love for David and his duty to protect you, Morrison continued. The evidence suggests he confronted David at least twice, trying to give him opportunities to confess and make restitution voluntarily. David refused? According to the private investigator's notes, David convinced Harold that the financial irregularities were temporary business investments that would ultimately benefit the family. He promised to return all the money after a major business deal concluded successfully. Harold had died believing that our son might still choose honesty over deception, love over greed. He'd built the case against David not as a first option, but as a final safeguard in case David's promises proved to be lies. They had been lies, of course. The promised restitution never materialized. The business deals were fictional, and David's theft had continued even as Harold lay dying in the hospital, trusting that his son would honor their private agreement. The federal investigation also revealed details about Sunny Acres that made my blood run cold. The facility where David had planned to warehouse me was the subject of its own criminal investigation for patient neglect, financial exploitation, and what investigators called systematic asset stripping of residents. Residents admitted to Sunny Acres typically died within 2 years, Agent Chen explained during her final briefing. Not from natural causes, but from deliberate medical neglect, over-medication, and what can only be described as intentional isolation designed to accelerate death. David hadn't just been planning to steal my money. He'd been planning to have me slowly murdered in an institution that specialized in disposing of elderly people whose assets had been completely drained. 6 months after the trial, I received an unexpected visitor. Marcus Chen's wife, Linda, appeared at my door on a rainy Thursday afternoon, carrying a manila envelope and wearing the exhausted expression of someone whose life had been completely destroyed. "Mrs. Whitmore, I know you have no reason to speak with me," she said, her voice shaking, "but there are things about your son that I think you need to know." Against my better judgment, I invited her in. Linda Chen was younger than I'd expected, perhaps 50, with graying hair and the kind of hollow look that comes from months of public humiliation and legal proceedings. "Marcus kept detailed files on all his clients," she began, opening the envelope with trembling hands. "The FBI seized most of them, but there were personal notes he kept separately, psychological profiles that went beyond the business requirements." She handed me a folder labeled David Whitmore, psychological assessment, personal notes. Chen's handwriting covered dozens of pages, documenting conversations with David that revealed aspects of my son's character I'd never suspected. Your son contacted Marcus 3 years ago, not the other way around, Linda said quietly. He'd researched elder abuse schemes online and specifically sought out Marcus's services because he'd already been stealing from you and needed professional guidance to avoid getting caught. The folder contained transcripts of phone calls where David discussed his impatience with the old man's lingering illness and his frustration with Mom's stubborn independence. Chen had documented David's increasing resentment toward Harold and me, his sense of entitlement to our assets, and his growing anger at what he called our selfishness in not dying quickly enough. David told Marcus that he'd been planning your parents' death since your father's first heart attack, Linda continued, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. He said he'd researched ways to accelerate your husband's decline and was considering methods to ensure your mother wouldn't survive long enough to spend her inheritance. The documents Linda showed me revealed that David had discussed poisoning Harold's medications, engineering accidents that would appear natural, and arranging for my accidental death after Harold was gone. Chen had apparently discouraged these extreme measures, not from moral concerns, but because murder investigations might expose the financial crimes they were already committing. Your son is a sociopath, Mrs. Whitmore, Linda said, her voice barely audible. Marcus documented behaviors and statements that indicate David has no genuine emotional attachment to you or your husband. He sees you as obstacles to wealth he believes he's entitled to. As Linda prepared to leave, she handed me one final document, a letter David had written to Chen just weeks before Harold's death. The old man is finally dying, but it's taking forever, and Mom is handling it better than I expected, the letter read. I need Mom to have a complete breakdown after Dad dies, something that will make the incompetency petition easy to justify. Do you have recommendations for psychological pressure techniques that could accelerate her mental deterioration without leaving obvious evidence? Chen had responded with a detailed plan for emotional manipulation designed to drive me into depression severe enough to support involuntary institutionalization. They hadn't just been planning to steal my money and warehouse me in a death facility. They'd been planning to break me psychologically first, to ensure that any resistance I might offer would be dismissed as the confusion of a grief-stricken woman losing her grip on reality. That evening, I sat in Harold's study and read every document Linda had brought, forcing myself to confront the complete truth about the son I'd raised and loved. David hadn't been corrupted by Chen's influence or driven to desperation by financial pressures. He had been planning Harold's and my destruction for years, with a calculating coldness that revealed the absence of any genuine human feeling toward his parents. The boy who'd cried in my arms when his pet hamster died, the teenager who'd brought me flowers on Mother's Day, the young man who'd promised to take care of Harold and me in our old age. That person had either never existed or had been gradually consumed by a greed so complete that it eliminated every trace of love, loyalty, and basic human decency. As I locked the documents away in Harold's safe, I realized that my husband's final gift hadn't just been the evidence to protect my freedom and financial security. It had been the knowledge that would allow me to understand exactly who David really was and why my grief for him needed to be absolute and final. The son I mourned was dead, not from external circumstances, but from choices he'd made that had destroyed everything good and decent inside him. And tomorrow, I would begin the process of building a life that honored Harold's memory while accepting that David was as lost to me as if he'd died in that courthouse the day he was arrested. 1 year after David's sentencing, I drove Harold's Mercedes to the cemetery where my husband rests, beneath a simple granite headstone that bears his name, dates, and the inscription, "Beloved husband who protected his family even in death." I brought fresh lilies, Harold's favorite flowers, and a letter I'd written but would never send. "Harold," I said aloud, sitting on the small bench beside his grave, "I finally understand what you were trying to tell me in those final months. When you kept saying that some people show you who they really are through their actions, you were preparing me for the truth about David." The past year had been a journey of reconstruction that I never expected to undertake at 69 years old. With the help of therapy, the support of friends I'd reconnected with, and the satisfaction of meaningful work, I'd built a life that honored both my grief and my determination to ensure that Harold's sacrifice mattered. 3 months after David's conviction, Detective Martinez had approached me with an unusual proposition. "Mrs. Whitmore, the FBI is developing a new program to train forensic accountants in elder abuse investigation techniques. Your case has become a model for how sophisticated these schemes have become. Would you consider consulting with us on training protocols?" I'd agreed immediately. Within weeks, I was traveling to FBI field offices, teaching agents and prosecutors how to recognize the financial patterns that indicated systematic elder abuse, how to document evidence that would survive legal challenges, and how to support elderly victims who'd been manipulated by their own family members. The work was more fulfilling than anything I'd done in my corporate career. Every case we solved, every family we protected, every criminal we convicted felt like a tribute to Harold's memory and validation of the pain we'd endured. But the most meaningful project emerged from an unexpected source. Linda Chen, Marcus's ex-wife, contacted me 6 months after our initial meeting with a proposal that would change both of our lives. "Mrs. Whitmore, I've been corresponding with other family members of Chen's clients, spouses and children who had no idea what their loved ones were planning. We want to start a support organization for families destroyed by elder abuse schemes. The organization we founded, called Harold's Legacy, became a comprehensive resource for families dealing with the aftermath of elder financial abuse. We provided counseling for elderly victims, support groups for family members who discovered their loved ones' criminal activities, and advocacy for stronger legal protections. Within a year, Harold's Legacy had helped over 200 families navigate the complex trauma of discovering that their most trusted family members had been planning their destruction. The support group meetings were the most difficult and most healing part of the work. Sitting in circles with other elderly people who'd been betrayed by their children, sharing stories of manipulation and theft and institutional planning, I found a community I'd never expected to need. "Eleanor," said Margaret, a 74-year-old woman whose daughter had stolen her entire retirement savings, "how do you get past the anger?" "I don't think you do get past it," I replied honestly, "but you can get through it. The anger becomes fuel for making sure other families don't experience what we've endured." 6 months ago, I received a letter from David in federal prison. It was the first communication I'd had from him since his sentencing, and I debated for weeks whether to read it. The letter was 5 pages of self-justification mixed with what appeared to be genuine remorse. David claimed that prison had given him perspective on his actions, that he understood the pain he'd caused, and that he hoped someday I might forgive him. "I never meant for things to go as far as they did," he wrote. "Chen convinced me that we were protecting you from your own confusion, that the institutionalization would be temporary, that you'd be happier with simplified responsibilities. I know now that I was lying to myself about my motivations, but at the time, I believed I was helping." The letter concluded with a request for prison visitation and a plea for the possibility of rebuilding our relationship after his release. I read the letter 3 times, then placed it in Harold's safe with all the other evidence of David's betrayal. Some truths are too fundamental to be undone by prison therapy and convenient repentance. David's actions hadn't been the result of temporary poor judgment or external manipulation. They'd been the expression of who he fundamentally was, someone capable of seeing his parents as obstacles to be eliminated rather than people to be cherished. That kind of moral corruption doesn't heal with time or counseling. It reveals itself under pressure, and once revealed, it can never be safely ignored again. I never wrote back to David, and I never visited him in prison. Some bridges, once burned completely, can't be rebuilt without compromising the safety of everyone who might have to cross them. Instead, I focused my energy on the life I was building and the work that gave Harold's suffering meaning. Harold's Legacy expanded to include a legal clinic that helped elderly victims navigate the complex process of recovering stolen assets, a training program for prosecutors specializing in elder abuse cases, and a research initiative that tracked financial crime patterns across multiple states. On the anniversary of David's sentencing, I received a call from Detective Martinez with news that brought everything full circle. "Mrs. Whitmore, I thought you'd want to know. We've just arrested another operation that was using Chen's methods to target elderly victims. The investigation that started with your case has now led to the conviction of over 100 criminals involved in elder abuse schemes across the country. Harold's final investigation hadn't just saved me from David's betrayal. It had protected hundreds of other families from experiencing the same devastating loss of trust and security. That evening, I sat in the study that had once been Harold's sanctuary and was now my office for Harold's legacy work. The walls were covered with thank you letters from families we'd helped, photographs from training seminars I'd conducted, and newspaper articles about cases we'd supported. But the most important item in the room was Harold's final letter to me, framed and positioned where I could see it every day. Eleanor, if you're reading this, then the evidence I've gathered has served its purpose in protecting you from David's plans. I'm sorry I couldn't confront him directly while I was alive, but I was afraid of what he might do if he felt cornered before you were prepared to defend yourself. Remember that you are stronger than any challenge you'll face, smarter than anyone who might try to deceive you, and more valuable than any assets they might try to steal. Build a life that proves David was wrong about everything. Wrong about your capabilities, wrong about your worth, and wrong about his right to control your future. You are not a victim to be managed. You are a force to be respected. Live accordingly. At 70 years old, I have built exactly the life Harold envisioned for me. A life of purpose, independence, and service that proves every day that David's assessment of my worth was as fundamentally flawed as his assessment of right and wrong. I never had grandchildren to carry on the family legacy. But through Harold's legacy and the hundreds of families we've protected, Harold's memory lives on in ways that David's children never could have provided. Some betrayals destroy families. Others, when survived with courage and purpose, create new families bound not by blood, but by shared commitment to preventing others from experiencing the same pain. Harold gave me the tools to survive our son's betrayal. I've used those tools to build something that ensures other families won't face that betrayal alone and unprepared. And every morning, when I wake up in the house that David planned to sell, managing the finances he planned to steal, living the independent life he planned to destroy, I know that Harold's final act of love succeeded completely. I am free, I am strong, and I am using my freedom and strength to protect others. That is the truest victory I could have achieved, and the most fitting tribute to the man who loved me enough to spend his final months ensuring my survival. David may have been my son by birth, but Harold remains my partner in this life and whatever comes after. And that partnership, built on love rather than greed, truth rather than manipulation, will endure long after David's prison sentence ends, and he discovers that some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt.